Welcome, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started, and I'm sure a lot more people will trickle in. Tonight's webinar is called Forest Biomass, Oregon and Beyond, with our presenters Rita Vaughan from the National Resources Defense Council and Dominick DellaSala from Wild Heritage. So I want to thank you for taking the time on what is a beautiful fall day here in Southern Oregon to be here on Zoom with us. My name is Carol Valentine, and I am the Forest Team Coordinator for the Oregon Chapter Sierra Club. And if you want to know more about our forest team and potentially get involved with the work we're doing, you can visit our chapter website at oregon.sierraclub.org. And today is the International Day of Action on Big Biomass. So part of our webinar will be to get a picture of what's happening around the globe with large-scale biomass energy and how that has been impacting communities and the environment in the southeastern US. And what we're facing here on the West Coast with both large scale and smaller scale biomass utilization, so that hopefully we can come together and avoid the destructive and damaging practices that they have been experiencing in other areas. What prompted our forest team to offer this webinar is that the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality has a biomass utilization work group that they've been convening to laudably look for alternatives to the open burning of logging debris in slash piles, which is a real air quality issue. And we got involved because we're interested in making sure that the decisions that are made to subsidize biomass utilization take us in the best direction possible. As efforts to scale up biomass utilization in the Pacific Northwest go forward, we want to ask the right questions so that the decisions that are made have the best chance of preserving or even reweaving the integrity of our ecosystems that support all life. So that is the other part of our webinar, looking at the context for using forest biomass and what some of the trade-offs are. And that context is in great part the logging and thinning of forests as a wildfire mitigation measure. So what are the trade-offs of that? That's one of the key questions. There are no silver bullets in the era of climate change, but we want to choose the best solutions we can and not go down a road that will take us in the wrong direction because we don't have time for that. And we may do irreparable harm. And we need to think about future generations to the best of our ability. So, of course, economics is a huge driver of this decision making, and it can be a factor that warps our outlook. So Sierra Club sees our role as putting nature and ecosystems first, and then looking for solutions that are economically just for our communities. And so just a note that we will be using the Q&A for our questions, and we'll be doing the question and answer at the end after both of our presenters have finished. So our first presenter, we are so lucky to have Dr. Dominick DellaSala with us tonight. Dominick is the chief scientist at Wild Heritage and the former president of the Society for Conservation Biology, North America section. He is also an internationally renowned researcher, author of over 300 science papers and books on forest, climate change, and endangered species, and has been involved in many peer-reviewed studies that have been published on topics related to our discussion tonight. So all of what you'll be seeing from him is from peer-reviewed studies. So thank you, Dominick, and we'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Sarah Clough, for organizing this, and thank you all for being here late on a Thursday after 5 o'clock. You know, you're going to see science in my presentation today, but I want to at least start out by appealing to your heart. And in all the work that I do, I'm blessed with a 4 decades career now, going to some of the most important forest places in the world. And I started my career mainly as a biodiversity scientist, cataloging nature in as many places as we could before it was gone. And so now a lot of the emphasis is switched over to carbon, which you'll see in my presentation. But the appeal I'm making to you is, in all likelihood, the Earth is going to cross the 1.5 degrees centigrade threshold in 3 more years. And that is startling. I'm a grandfather. I have grandkids. I worry about what this world is going to be like when they're my age. And so what we're doing right now is going to affect generations to come, because every time we put a molecule of CO2 in the atmosphere, there's a long hang time. It's still up there from the Industrial Revolution. And so putting more carbon into the atmosphere is not the way to go. And while there may be some good intentions about what to do with the logging slash, the biomass burning, et cetera, you'll see in my presentation, it just doesn't pencil out. So we've got to find other alternatives. So, I mean, that's kind of the nutshell of what I'll be presenting. So let me get there through a lot of the peer-reviewed studies that I've been working on in my last 5 or 6 years. So I need to share the screen. If I can get there. Whoop, there we go. Okay, you should now be able to see my screen. I'll get into presentation mode here in a second. Okay, so you should all see my screen at this point, right?
Yes, we see the screen.
It's going into slideshow mode. There we go. All right.
Excellent.
So I think this is the topic that I've been asked to address. And of course, my colleague Rita will follow up with her input on this too. But it's this situation that we see in a lot of places in at least the Western United States, and increasingly in places in Canada. I work in Canada as well. We're seeing the same kind of push for thinning and biomass utilization. Well, what does it really mean? I think there's a lot of false narrative framing around thinning and the woody biomass so-called solution. And it kind of stems around this issue of good versus bad fire. And I've published numerous times on this is the wrong narrative. There is no such thing as good versus bad fire in fire adapted systems. And you'll see that in a minute, but you know, it leads to a command and control over nature. This is an article that I published last year that you'll be hearing about in the talk as well, that we could never be in a position to command and control nature. When we try, it's always devastating. We've tried it with apex predators, and it doesn't work, except it leads to extinction events. And we're trying it with apex natural processes, and it's not going to work. And you'll see why in my presentation. But the narrative goes that, you know, the way to get to good fires is to thin and then burn, and that may even slow or stop fires. Yeah, under some conditions it can, but there are costs, and it doesn't work in extreme fire weather. And of course, the narrative goes on to state how biomass is the win-win. We can displace fossil fuels just by raking the forest, right? It's oversimplified there, but you know who said that. And so the good versus bad fire, the good versus bad witch, it's just not ecological in how fires are the architect of biodiversity that you'll see in my presentation when they're operating within historic bounds. So this narrative really is upsetting to me. It's an oversimplification. It's wrong. It's used in a lot of grade school publications. You know, the agencies use it. Even the Nature Conservancy has used the good fire, bad fire. I've been to fire conferences. I've seen kiosks about good fire versus bad fire. And it makes me scratch my head because what a lot of people think is bad fire, the high severity burn patches actually have the most biodiversity in them. So you tell that to all the woodpeckers and all other species that are using those high severity burn patches that they're in a bad fire. It's so subjective, and it leads to the command and control attitude about nature that never wins. It can't win. And so the false narrative goes like this: our forests are sick and unhealthy because of insects, disease, bad wildfires, droughts, windstorms, space aliens, you name it. Fill in the blank. I've been in front of congressional committees about this. And then in practice, logging is always the healthy solution. And no one really looks at the collateral damages, ecosystem damages, carbon, climate damages. And the large-scale thinning is not really aimed at small trees. It almost always includes the large fire-resistant trees and all other kinds of activities that are just going to cause more damage than if the forest were just managed for natural ecosystem processes. Every single fire policy is baked into this narrative. And I watched my hometown of Talent, Oregon burn down in the Alameda fire while millions of dollars was being spent in the backcountry thinking that that was going to protect homes. It didn't. It failed. And it's going to continue to fail because climate is really driving the processes that we're not paying enough attention to. But let me start with the biodiversity implications here about good versus bad fire. We're now working on a second edition of this book. It should be out in the spring. And again, it's reaffirming that fire in dry forest is as important as rain is to rainforest. From a biodiversity standpoint, ecosystems and species have many adaptations to fire systems. All fire severities, now this is the kicker that a lot of the press and a lot of the public do not get. All fire severities are currently operating at an historic deficit, with some notable exceptions. We can talk about that in Q&A, but by and large, we have a fire deficit, and I'll talk about why that is going forward. However, climate change is increasingly the root cause of these big fires that we're seeing today. There's an incredible field of climate attribute science that I've been involved in the last few years. It's one of the most exciting parts of climate change science that's now attributing specific catastrophic events to certain anthropogenic climate variables, as you will hear in the talk as I go forward. Keep that in mind, that as we see increasingly top-down drivers of fire behavior, bottom-up drivers become less significant. So let's begin with the biodiversity hypothesis, that this landscape often is called a disaster, a catastrophe, a moonscape. I've heard all those terms, but we go out there and we find some of the most extraordinary biodiversity that's associated with pyrodiversity. The diversity of different fire severity patches provides habitat for all species across the successional gradient, from deer in early successional to spotted owls in late successional. This is not a disaster. This is a blessing. And as long as it's remaining in historic bounds, and we've already talked about it's below historic fire severity return intervals, then it's beneficial ecologically. So there really is no good versus bad fire. Please get rid of that jargon. It doesn't work ecologically. There are many adaptations that ecosystems have. The larger the trees, the more resistant they are to fire. There are some exceptions. We're seeing that now in the giant sequoia system, and we can talk about that in Q&A as well. Some of those big trees are dying in climate-driven fire events now, but there are also resilient components to it. That seed rain often happens after a high severity burn. The example, of course, is serotinous cones of certain populations of pine species that are particularly born out of fire. They need high severity fire. Thinning in those systems is just, it's counterproductive because they need to burn. All right, I mentioned the climate gorilla in the room. And this is an interesting figure that I put together a few years ago. On the left side, you see in the early 1900s, during the Dust Bowl era, there were droughts, heat events, and large fires. And then there was a dip down during the mid-century that corresponded to a cooling period in the climate and the advent of mechanized fire suppression. And the Forest Service started flexing its muscles. It got really good at putting out fires. You know, Smokey Bear was out there talking about stomping out all fires. The Forest Service was talking about every fire out by 2 p.m. the next day. And it created this lull, this false sense of security. Hey, let's all build in the wild areas. You know, who would not want to live in nature? You know, let's get those homes out there, build them in places because, you know, fire's not a concern. And look what's happened. We've entered the Anthropocene, the period of rapid climate change acceleration, where we're increasingly starting to see an increase in acres burning, attributed to a large extent with the warm up and the change in precipitation patterns. This is the perfect storm because no amount of fire suppression is going to stop this. And we've got all these millions of homes now built in harm's way. We don't build on top of volcanoes. Why are we continuing to sprawl into these places that at some point are going to get visited by a fire like my town did? So we published this paper in 2022 that I think shocked a lot of people that are wed to the fuel-centric model, that this is really like Sisyphus pushing this big boulder up a hill that's increasing in size and amplitude because of climate change. And we're down here in the ground thinking we can affect a global process. It's not going to happen. We're going to get less and less effective. And we're going to continue to spend billions of dollars. You can see from this graph, the Sisyphus graph, that the total area burning has been going up and up and up. And the amount of money being spent by the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Interior keeps going up and up and up. And so really, are we getting anywhere with this approach? I argue, and my colleagues argue, no, because climate is really the top-down driver now. And fuels are still important, but they're secondary compared to climate. So that kind of begs the question about thinning. You know, should we be doing it? And if we do it, what's the right way to do it? Well, there are substantial costs. There is collateral damages, both to ecosystems and to carbon that's dumped into the atmosphere that I'll talk about here. But if you do everything right, and you leave all the large trees, which is seldom done in thinning operations, you thin from below, you vary the spacing, you avoid clear cutting the understory. I've seen a lot of this in fuel treatments where there's no understory anymore. It's been type converted to a weed infested understory that lacks biodiversity. So even if you leave the canopy in place, you no longer have a functional understory. And that impacts everything right down to the soil and the mycorrhizae connections. You have to follow a prescribed burning and some sort of slash removal. We can talk about that too, but there's a cost associated with it. And then you got to contain your flammable weeds. Often they run cows right over the same places that have been burned and logged, and you're type converting the understories to a flashier fuel bed by doing this. And this is almost always missed by fire managers. Close and obliterate roads. Something like over 80% of all fire ignitions nationwide are human caused, but you never see anything mentioned about that in any of fuel treatment projects. All the money being spent is on thinning and very little on road obliteration and reducing road access, which is going to give you human caused ignitions. So you do everything right, then you got to be lucky enough to catch lightning in a bottle. So the odds of your treated site getting hit by a lightning bolt within 10 to 15 years it depends on the site, are pretty tiny. And so you're doing all of this work, you're putting all of this carbon into the atmosphere with a very low probability, less than 1% based on empirical evidence. And even if you scale up to get the odds higher, you're going to be putting more carbon into the atmosphere than if that same area burned in a fire. We actually have done the plots on this, as well as other Oregon State carbon scientists, and it doesn't pencil out from a carbon standpoint. So these are all things that need to be carefully considered and are seldom considered when thinning is conducted. It can be, less damaging, but it doesn't mean that it's going to lower fire intensity unless it's under low to moderate fire weather and you happen to get lucky. If it's an extreme fire weather, forget it. We've seen pyro tornadoes, we've seen hurricane force winds taking out towns like Lahaina in Hawaii. My town was taken out by 40-mile-plus-an-hour wind velocities that no amount of thinning was going to stop firebrands spreading in that fire. And yet we see extraordinary amounts of money being dumped into thinning and biomass utilization by several administrations. And even under the Biden administration, there's a ton of money in there to expand what they call innovative use of wood, including for energy. And yet, we've got an administration that claims to be, really focused on climate change. And yet all of this money is going into the wrong approach, whether it's the state of California, the state of Oregon, or the previous administrations or the current administrations. And now we're hearing on, even our governor supporting more feedstock utilization as if it's some sort of carbon neutral, magic wand means to reduce fossil fuel emissions, but it's not. And it really is a chicken and egg situation here. What came first? The biomass that you've taken out of the forest, or the way you're disposing it? And in carbon accounting, it's just like physics. Just because you've removed carbon from the forest doesn't mean that it doesn't have a cost. Okay, you've been doing thinning for whatever reason, but to say that it's carbon neutral is so disingenuous. It's not. It doesn't pencil out. You may have a legitimate reason to do it. You may think it's going to lower fire intensity, whatever your reason for it, it doesn't pencil out. And these are some graphics that were done by NRDC. And, thank you, Rita, for the work that your organization did on this. But it's a set of simulations, depending on how much of the wood pellets come from, whether you use 40% of the tree, 70% of the whole tree, or 20% of the whole tree. Pay attention to that black line. That black line are the emissions from using biomass as an energy source relative to other power sectors. So let's say you use 70% of the whole trees. Look at that black line in the lower right-hand corner relative to emissions from even coal in that dotted yellow line. You're producing more emissions. It's eventually going to tail off, maybe 55 years or so. But we're in a climate emergency. We don't have 55 years of continuing to dump emissions into the atmosphere. This is the wrong approach. And we've had studies from Oregon researchers that show even a business as usual approach has the lowest emissions in the forestry sector relative to using bioenergy from biomass utilization. In addition, by doing that, you're encouraging at least a logging footprint to feed those operations that extends out to an estimated 250 miles. So what you're doing is you're promoting logging over a big radius, and you start dumping a bunch of these on the landscape, and you got a problem. And so in Canada, where I work, in British Columbia, they're taking whole trees, grinding them up into these pellets, shipping them to mostly the UK. Drax is the importer, and they're claiming it's clean, renewable energy. I mean, even if you discount everything I just said about the source of emissions on the site and burning the material, putting it on a barge, shipping it down the Pacific coastline over to the Panama Canal and in the Atlantic and up the UK, you got to at least kind of recognize that's not a smart strategy from a carbon standpoint alone, just from the fossil fuel emissions. It's just, grinding up these whole logs now is putting pressure on primary forests, as we're seeing in British Columbia, again, where I work. Those yellow dots that you see there are biomass plants right smack in the middle of primary forests that are not protected. And they're now entering primary forests, taking out whole logs, grinding them into pellets, shipping them overseas to Drax, and calling that carbon neutral. It just doesn't pencil out. Come on, come up with another argument that it's least legitimate than trying to pencil this one out. It doesn't work. So I'm going to end with 2 or 3 more slides here. This declaration was signed by Biofuel Watch. It had 110 groups. It was done a few years ago, but it still makes sense. I mean, the European Union has got to stop thinking that this is an energy neutral, carbon neutral source of burning material. It's not. It's going backwards. We should not be burning wood. It's such an inefficient means for generating BTUs, and it causes more damage to the atmosphere than if you even were burning coal. And, it's not going to change our situation for the better. Even if it's done in a more reasonable way, it still has a cost. And, this kind of harkens back to my early days when I was in grad school, that we learned that there's no such thing as a free lunch. There isn't. And we've got to start recognizing this, that you can't get something for nothing. Everything has a cost. Biomass, you have to put energy in to get energy out. And energy in this case is fossil fuels. And energy out are emissions. Even the substitution issue has got major problems. Dr. Mark Harmon at Oregon State University estimated that wood substitution was grossly exaggerated by a factor of 2 to 100 times the benefit when compared to steel. And so I see this all the time. Let's use CLT. Yeah, if you're using small logs, it's better than using old growth, but it still has a cost, and you can't discount that. There's lop and scatter. Maybe that's a better way of dealing with the issue, so you're not burning it, but it still has a cost. And we can't ignore these costs. We've got to be at least responsible and honest about it, that everything has a cost. And here's my version of a cost gradient. And I worked on this with the Sierra Club folks. The biggest bang for the carbon investment is to protect forests in their natural conditions. Primary forest, older forest, they are carbon warehouses. There's no substitute for that. I think it was Bill Gates that was doing a prize for the most energy efficient means to get off of fossil fuels, whatever it was. We were going to submit a photo of an old growth forest and see if we could win the prize. It's the best means for capturing carbon and hanging on to it long term. And so you go down that gradient. Yeah, you could be better, more responsible land stewards, but anytime you take trees out of the forest, you incur a cost. And that cost gets more and more depending on how intense the operation is and whether or not you burn the material. So I'm going to stop there. I've used up my time and turn it back over to Carol. So thank you for bearing with me on that. We'll take questions later.
Thank you so much, Dominic. That was a packed presentation. And I have several questions, so hopefully we'll have time to answer those as well. But right now I want to introduce Rita Vaughan Frost, who is a forest advocate with Natural Resources Defense Council, commonly known as NRDC. And Rita has more than a decade of organizing experience against extractive corporate interests, and that includes 8 years with the Dogwood Alliance in the southern US. Rita focuses on the intersection of energy and land to ensure that bioenergy policy serves forests, communities, and the climate. So thank you so much for being here, Rita.
Great. Thanks so much, Carol. Let me see if I can share my screen. All righty. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Awesome. Well, hi, everybody. As Carol said, my name is Rita. I'm a forest advocate with the Natural Resources Defense Council, and probably similar to many of y'all, I am coming to you today from unceded Kalapuya land. I actually live in Monroe, which is between Corvallis and Eugene, and I'm right down the road from Whole Oaks, if anybody knows them. So I see logging trucks on a regular basis. I'm a born and raised Southerner, though, which I think is a really important piece of context and background for this conversation, as a lot of it will be based on my experience in the Southern United States, being ground zero for the export-oriented wood pellet market. I have been working with communities that have confronted the wood pellet manufacturing industry, including Drax, which Dr. DellaSala mentioned in his presentation of having an impact up in BC. They also are proposing a facility in Washington that I'll speak a little bit about. So as the wood pellet production industry looks at the Pacific Northwest as their next area for fiber sourcing and export, I think that the lessons and the experience of the Southeast should be brought to bear in preparing the Pacific Northwest for what it could experience. When I refer to biomass today, it's just shorthand for wood pellets created from forest material and then used as energy. The material needed to create these wood pellets is sourced from forests. It's cut down, put on 18-wheelers, sent to manufacturing facilities that are up to 50 to 60 miles away. And in proposals in California, that radius is actually increased to 100 miles away. Turned into the wood pellets at the facilities. They're put on rail and truck again, transported to a port, and then finally sent to a smokestack to be turned into heat and electricity. And the question is just begging to be asked, like, what is the driver here? Dom touched on it a little bit, but really what it gets down to is international green energy subsidies propping up this bioenergy industry. The whole reason there are subsidies actually is because of a carbon accounting loophole. So in most situations, as I'm sure many of y'all are familiar with, carbon dioxide is counted as emissions when it's released into the atmosphere, where it is released into the atmosphere. So when the power plant burns coal, those emissions are counted at the smokestack. This is true in most electricity production, agriculture, many other industries. However, with bioenergy, there's this weird loophole that started at the United Nations level for emissions accounting. The carbon emissions are actually counted during the tree's harvest, but not where the trees are burned. Because most of the bioenergy in the world is consumed in Europe and the UK, most of the trees that the EU and the UK are consuming are wood pellets that are harvested from other countries. European countries then can burn these trees, aka wood pellets, essentially for free when it comes to their accounting protocols, meaning there are no emissions counted against them because they didn't cut the trees down. So this creates a gross incentive to burn biomass as an energy source, counted as renewable, and therefore look like their emissions are being reduced. On the US side of things, there are indeed subsidies that go to the bioenergy industry, but they're at a much lower amount than they are at the international level. But it's still worth mentioning because there are threats that they could become worse, right? So right now, the federal RFS maintains that fuels made from wood sourced from a federal forest actually cannot earn credits. That's an important distinction. This means that facilities like the Lakeview RNG facility, if anybody's familiar with it, can only source, from private land if it wants to snag both state and federal credits. However, there is a counter movement to this politically, and Rep Garamendi down in California is expected to drop a bill at any time that could actually remove that restriction. So there are threats to this changing in the United States, and a lot more subsidies being able to go towards bioenergy. I want to talk about markets in these next couple of slides. So back to that policy piece. So beginning with the Renewable Energy Directive in 2009, that was set by the EU. They were the first to designate biomass as a source of renewable energy, qualifying for massive amounts of subsidies. And this map is showing the production and consumption supply and demand that had grown to the place where it was in 2017, with warm yellow and red circles representing the demand, and then green representing the supply of wood pellets for combined heat and power or co-firing facilities. You can see that the United States is pretty much ground zero for wood pellet production. And when this map was created in 2017, that was primarily placed in the southern United States. When the Renewable Energy Directive was created in 2009, we had nearly zero wood pellets being exported from the southern United States, to the point in 2017 where there was 5 million tons coming out of southern forests. And then the important thing to look at now is where this growth is projected and where it is projected to grow. In the United States, you can see that the amount of supply that we are being looked to supply for global energy markets is nearly doubling. And two of the places that are going to be increasing the most actually are Japan and South Korea. Again, this is a really important point for Oregon and the Pacific Northwest. This very large increase of demand coming from South Korea and Japan is very likely going to be supplied from Pacific Northwest forests in Canada and the United States. Japan and South Korea are following the example of the European Union and the United Kingdom as they're setting out their renewable energy policies. Japanese officials, for instance, say that biomass will play an expanding role in achieving Japan's goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 46% by 2030. Furthermore, South Korea has included biomass burning in its renewable energy portfolio standard, leading to 17 biomass energy plants that are currently operating and at least 4 more on the way. These are booms for the expansion of biomass burning that is happening outside of Europe. And as Dom was kind of pointing out, it could really lead to a severe undercounting of actual carbon emissions and worsening climate change while putting pressure on already beleaguered forests. The Pacific Northwest really hasn't experienced industrial scale export-oriented wood pellet production. It's important to look at the Southeast, where the wood pellet market has been operating for a decade, potentially to see what could happen. So these are some pictures that I was able to take on investigation with Dogwood Alliance. And the important thing that we're trying to show here is, the forest that they're taking from, the forest practices that they're using, and then also what's left behind. It's really often claimed, and it has always been claimed, that woody biomass is using scraps, waste wood, thinnings, wood that's not suitable for other timber purposes. It'll be put under a lot of different monikers. One thing that they will hardly ever say is that they are taking trees, they are taking whole trees, and they're leaving a lot of waste actually behind at the field, at the site. The truth is that there is surprisingly little waste wood. It's difficult and expensive to gather and transport when it does exist, and oftentimes the technology of biomass wood pellet production facilities is not equipped to take twigs, branches, tops, the things that they're saying that they can use to create wood pellets. In fact, they need bigger trees to be able to create the wood pellets. And the trash that they do get from on site is what they use to burn as a co-generating energy source for their facilities. New bioenergy demand is increasingly being met and derived directly from forests. And in large part, this is because of the scale of the biomass energy industry. Enormous volumes are taken from forests as whole trees and logs. And there has been research done to show that volumes of wood being taken out of forests have increased because of biomass demand. And that another finding in that study was that the intensity of harvests are increasing because of biomass demand, because the quantity criteria makes more logging operations financially viable. Now, Industrial scale biomass production does threaten to find a foothold in California and Washington, and I'll say the Pacific Northwest writ large, with a slightly different, albeit similarly misleading justification, which is wildfire mitigation. And I'm so happy Dr. Dominick DellaSala went before me to kind of spell out why that is a misleading justification. But it is being used as the justification to drive a biomass market. There are favorable policy environments in California as well as Washington that are popping up. And there are two important entities that actually have sourcing radiuses down into Oregon forests, down and up into Oregon forests. One is Golden State Natural Resources, that is in California. They are proposing 2 wood pellet facilities. The one that they're proposing in Lassen County will actually have its reaches up into Southern Oregon. And then there's a facility being proposed by Drax, which is a port facility and a wood pellet production facility. It's a combo play that's going to be in Longview, Washington. And that will have its reaches down into the very northern parts of Oregon. GSNR is an important one to note for y'all down in California, because while they are starting with these 2 wood pellet production facilities, they have very much said that if they can, they will build up to 16 facilities. So these are just some screen grabs of the radius of the sourcing for those facilities that I was mentioning. The one on the left-hand side is the Golden State Natural Resources proposed facility in Lassen County. The areas that I highlighted are just for Oregon itself. And then I don't have as good of a map drawn just yet for the Drax facility in Longview, but that will have its reaches down into a mix of state forest, national forest, and private forest lands. This is just a screen grab from Golden State Natural Resources website. I like to take these screen grabs from time to time with wood pellet manufacturing entities because their language oftentimes changes over the course of their history. But one of the things that you can really see right now is their framing, their short slogan of restore, revitalize, reinvest, in large part. Wood pellet manufacturing and the biomass industry writ large really relies on public perception that biomass production will reduce catastrophic wildfires, will help the world move towards clean, renewable energy, and they will help us resist wildfires and them encroaching into our communities because it'll remove wood from the landscape. And that is also how they sell themselves to policymakers to get a lot of policy backing. This is another picture I took while I was with Dogwood Alliance. This is an overhead of a facility in North Carolina that actually produces 600,000 tons of wood pellets per year. It's slightly smaller actually than the facility that is being proposed in Lassen County by Golden State Natural Resources. That facility is at 700,000 tons right now, and it's just slightly larger than the Longview, Washington Drax facility, which is going to be 500,000 tons. So I wanted to show this one because it's kind of nicely in between those 2 facilities that could impact Oregon forests. Most importantly is, again, to notice the scale and size of what the biomass industry demands to create their product. I like to point out the 18-wheelers for size. And then I think that this quote from Dr. Mary Booth at the Partnership for Policy Integrity really spells out something important when it comes to biomass, which is that biomass creates heat trapping carbon dioxide at every step of the process. They emit more carbon dioxide at the smokestack than coal, depending on timeframes and the material that it's made up of. Logging forests to produce wood pellets for combustion releases carbon dioxide when we need to be cutting emissions instead and storing more carbon dioxide on the landscape. And then furthermore, conservative estimates, which we're going to use conservative estimates out here in the Pacific Northwest until wood pellet production really ramps up. But it shows that burning wood pellets for electricity will increase carbon pollution to the atmosphere for more than 40 years, which is a timeline that we just are not and cannot be operating on. Importantly is the air pollution that is created from wood pellet production facilities. This is something that has only really recently come to light in the last 4 or 5 years as communities have spoken up time and time again about their public health being impacted by the wood pellet facilities that sit in their backyard. Wood pellet mills and pellet burning itself both releases health-harming pollutants. Importantly, there is going to be particulate matter. That's the fine dust that communities are always complaining about. NOx, SOx, carbon monoxide. There's heavy metals like lead and mercury that comes from wood pellet production. Hazardous air pollutants, including carcinogens, and all of these can be linked back to premature death, serious illnesses, respiratory and heart diseases, and even cancer. The outcry from communities in the southern United States has become so loud that the EPA is actually conducting an epidemiological study around wood pellet facilities to make the connection between wood pellet production and health harms that have been incurred by poor and oftentimes Black and brown communities. Oh, and the last thing that I'll just mention about this is that for the facilities in California and the facility in Longview, Washington that I'm mentioning, we need to put that in the context of what those communities are already facing. So the Longview, Washington, Longview, Kelso area is already struggling with severely compromised air quality. The same thing is true for the facility that Golden State Natural Resources proposes down in Tuolumne County in California, as well as their port terminal that is proposed for the Port of Stockton in California. All suffer from poor air quality already. They shouldn't be burdened with another polluting industry. Furthermore, in the Southeast, the wood pellet industry is twice as likely to put their dirty plants in Black or minority neighborhoods than in white ones. The industry treats these communities as dumping grounds and exposes residents to the noise, dust, odors, air pollution that comes alongside their operations. So this is a map as well as a couple screen grabs from studies that are making the link between wood pellet production and environmental injustice. Finally, I'll just say, there are some immediate threats in the Pacific Northwest with that Drax facility in Longview, Washington, the build out of industrial scale wood pellet facilities in California, and the narrative that forests must be cleared, thin for wildfire mitigation is only serving an industry like wood pellet biomass production, which is reliant on subsidies and positive public perception. NRDC is really committed to stopping this build out in the Pacific Northwest. So please don't hesitate to be in touch with me. I think I included my email on my very first slide, and we're going to be sending those slides out. Thanks so much for having me here today. And Carol, I'll just pass it back to you.
Thanks so much, Rita. That was a lot of information and so much food for thought from both of you. We have some great questions, and I would just like to open up our Q&A now. I know some of the questions were already answered within the Q&A window, but I think folks might be interested in those answers. So we have a volunteer who will be helping with our Q&A. So I'll introduce Deborah Higby, who is the chair of the Conservation Committee for the Oregon Chapter Sierra Club. Thanks so much, Deborah. And I may jump in with a question of my own after a few of these.
All right, there's quite a few questions here. The first one is from Matt McCrae. Are there any biomass-powered power plants in Oregon that use whole trees in any percentage? If so, where are they located? Are there timber companies in Oregon who export whole trees or pellets from whole trees overseas for power generation?
So I took a stab at that, and I sent that to Matt as an answer. Thanks, Matt, for asking that question. And I directed him to the oregon.gov/energy website that has statistics on bioenergy use in Oregon. And there are 17 plants that are in operation associated with the timber industry, another 21 that are feedstock for heating hospitals and such, and schools. Some of it is exported, as you'll see in that link. I don't know how much of it is whole logs, but as Rita pointed out in her presentation, the economics of doing this is that you get more bang economically from using a whole tree. But they also use other parts, including the milling waste materials and other organic materials, not just from forests. But I mean, the biggest concern is when they throw whole logs in there, because as you've seen from my presentation, based on that NRDC simulation, if they're using whole logs, they're getting worse air pollution than if they were burning coal. And we're seeing this increasingly, like in British Columbia, in the inland rainforest, where I've done carbon analysis. We've seen new pellet plants come online, supported by Drax, that are taking whole trees. And in BC, they're cutting down these ancient cedars that are over 1,500 years old. And they don't determine beforehand if there's an economic value to the tree. They wait for them to cut it down, realize it's got a decaying core. They can't use it in lumber, so they're grinding up these 1,600-year-old trees into pellets and then shipping them overseas. So we're seeing this increasingly in different places. At some point, they run out of the feedstock from Slash or somewhere else, and they have to keep feeding the machinery. So I'll toss it back to Rita to see if she's got some input on that one too.
Oh, I don't think I have all that much to add because that was so comprehensive, Dom. But if y'all want to learn more about that sourcing that's coming out of Canada, I direct you to the BBC program called Panorama. They did a really great investigation with some Canada NGOs to show the sourcing of the biomass industry in Canada. And so you can see, you know, a third party basically investigate. And then the other thing is that just over Christmas last year, there was a whistleblower report that came out of the Southeast with the journalist outlet Manga Bay. If y'all know Manga Bay, I think I included another screen grab from them during my presentation. But basically, the whistleblower from Enviva said that the whole notion of taking waste is a complete lie, and that they're taking whole trees, around wood. And then the last thing that I'll say is that I can confirm this with the preparation that's going into the Golden State Natural Resources Project down in California. Their whole website is basically based off of them taking thinnings and residues, but in the economic analyses that they've done for their facilities, they're projecting to use 60 to 70% roundwood and only 8 to 9% of actual thinnings that are coming out of California forests. So we could expect more of the same in Oregon if the biomass industry really does increase its reach into this state and doesn't just have the sourcing radius from other states coming into Oregon, but actually decides to build export-oriented wood pellet markets.
Thank you. I want to jump in just real quick to say that in the state of Oregon, you know, with the subsidies, there will be an opportunity to weigh in on policy, and there will be some restrictions on feedstocks. And I believe that they're currently talking about these residues needing to be used within the state of Oregon in order to qualify for state subsidies. Now, if that federal subsidy restriction is removed, then you know, it's just a big question mark. But, you know, we are in there trying to make it as good as it can be if there are going to be subsidies put in place. And I just want to encourage people to pay attention, and we'll let folks know when there's an opportunity to weigh in on rulemaking.
All right, Carol, this question is probably for you. Will the slides be shared?
Yes, we will be sharing slides with folks.
Yeah, one important caveat on that. Find the share it, but please don't post them online. I don't know if I've gone through every single slide to make sure that I don't have a copyright problem.
All right. So are biomass plants in forests located in private or public forests or both?
Sorry, was that about sourcing? Is it coming from private or public or both?
Right. Are the biomass plants in forests located in private or public forests or both?
I think I'll just answer that in relation to the sourcing. The sourcing that's happening in the Southeast is almost all coming from private forests, right? I would say 100% of it is coming from private forests without actually being able to back that up with the statistics. But the thing is that the forest ownership in the Southeast, 90% of forests in the Southeast are owned privately. And then furthermore, there aren't that many federal forests in the Southeast. So that kind of limits it. But out west, particularly with this Golden State Natural Resources Project I keep talking about, they have a master stewardship agreement with the U.S. Forest Service to be sourcing from national forests. So that is something that is just like a model set out that could be of concern in Oregon. And then as far as the Drax facility goes, that's definitely going to be taking from a mix of ownership classes. It's going to be taking from state, federal, as well as private forests. That much is pretty much, it's pretty clear to us so far within that campaign. And then the last thing is that unfortunately, the state subsidies are important as far as like an opportunity to weigh in on the process and try to limit what state subsidies and federal subsidies go to biomass utilization for energy purposes. But in large part, they're being driven by fire mitigation and wildfire policies, and then biomass utilization for anything gets kind of looped into those. And then furthermore, they're just minuscule compared to the international subsidies. The UK is one example. They give $1.2 billion to Drax, which is the world's largest burner of biomass, every single year. That pencils out to more than, $2 million a day. So they're getting massive amounts of subsidies, and this trickles down into their ability to be able to source material from so far away, put it on very expensive ships, and bring it back to the UK. So I'll just give that piece of context.
Yeah, let me just jump in too and just support everything that Rita just said on federal lands. It's a growing threat, and the federal agencies are swimming in cash right now. From the infrastructure bill, Inflation Reduction Act, there's tens of millions of dollars going into this now under wood innovation grants. We're going to see a lot more of this propping up. I actually was on the ground in one project that really broke my heart. I was on the Stanislaus National Forest after the Rim Fire in this beautiful forest. It was a complex early cereal forest. It was old growth at one point. A high severity burn came through it. It was such an interesting mix of biodiversity because it had wetland inclusions in it, and it was just crawling with all kinds of wildlife. The conifers were coming back, and yet the agency said that it would not be a forest unless they got in there, salvage logged it, and they were able to do this with a nonprofit that worked with them and got a grant from HUD, the housing grant. And it went into biomass, which is, as Rita pointed out, mostly located in BIPOC communities. And instead of this beautiful forest that was supporting great gray owls, California spotted owls, and tons of birds and all kinds of pollinators, they did a clear-cut salvage operation on it and sent it out for biomass. And really, it broke my heart to see that because of the amount of misinformation that went into it, as those dead trees are going to produce more carbon than if we burned it. And that's just not the case. And yet we're seeing a lot more of this. So, I mean, all of those subsidies are only going to make the problem a lot worse, whether you're on private, state, or federal lands. It's scaling up.
All right, Sarah Brinker would like to know, does the new Senate Bill 253 have implications for the pellet industry in California?
I'm not familiar with Senate Bill 253, so if anybody else is, please feel free to take the question.
I will just say that we should talk, Sarah, because I want to know about this. Yeah, well, if we find out, we can send that information out with our follow-up.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Matt McCray would like to know, does the recent increase in lumber prices change the economics for burning whole logs to generate electricity?
Gosh, Dom, I'm curious about your answer to this too, but this was something that I was always asked when I would go over to Europe and the UK to lobby on this issue, was like, how can you be showing me pictures of whole trees or even old trees that were coming out of southern forests to feed our biomass demand? The economics should not be penciling out. And the problem is that the subsidies grossly swayed this industry to be profitable and actually to be competing for certain trees and certain lumber, which in a world without the subsidies, they wouldn't be able to take that material. The other problem is, as Dom so rightly pointed out, in Canada, you could be taking these really important ecological trees. So you could be taking habitat trees, you could be taking snags, you could be taking things that would in large part be left in the forest, were it not for biomass, were it not for an industry that could take any material, grind it up and create a pellet, right, and then be burned. So unfortunately, that's why we talk about biomass increasing the reach of logging and also increasing the intensity of logging in ways that it hadn't before.
You got it. And the only thing I would add to that is the wonderful work that Dogwood Alliance did years ago, mapping the explosion of biomass pellet plants in the Southeast, mainly because you could grow the pellets quickly. All you need is fast growing trees. And in 10 to 15 years, you got the pellet source. And so it pencils out economically because everything's on short rotation logging in those areas. And we saw, hundreds of those little mills popping up all over the place with very big logging footprints to feed the animal, the machine. Right, Rita?
Yeah, you got it right. It's very unfortunate, but it's very true. We are seeing this, I guess, the situation where in a large part, some of the forests were just naturally becoming restored in a way and kind of increasing their resilience to climate change because paper and pulp mills were shutting down. And then with the arrival of the biomass industry, it ramped it up again. And the Southeast is still one of the largest wood baskets in the world. Now it's being driven by biomass demand more than anything else.
All right, Terry Wright wants to know, how do we stop Thrax from opening a shop in Longview?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I encourage you to email me because I'm currently working with a coalition of pretty local environmental groups, as well as this great blue-green alliance between environmental groups and labor groups in Longview, Washington, to watch out for the permits that are coming and make sure that they're supplying them with substantive comments and feedback. And then furthermore, there is a policy approach. So that coalition is also making sure that they're doing outreach with the Washington delegation to talk about how the policies are just kind of like paving the way for the Longview facility to be set up. But it is of extreme concern, and there has been discussion about how do we bring Oregon into the picture because Oregon forests will be impacted as well. So I feel like this is just one of those first steps, and I'm grateful that you're asking about that.
There's another question by Laura Hader. Could seaweed be grown with CO2 gas for pellets to burn instead of using trees?
Yeah, I think so. I think, there was another question in the chat about using seaweed, algae, whatever. I think, yeah, because we actually need to get to some sort of an industrial ecology where we're doing more of these low carbon footprint energy innovative approaches, maybe couple it with solar and wind production in the same area to reduce the footprint. But I do think you can reduce that carbon footprint by using algae, because first of all, they don't have a lot of carbon at the source, so you're not emitting carbon by taking it out as much, but everything has a cost. There's no free lunch. It's just a relative thing. It's like that last slide that I showed. So it probably would pencil out a lot better than if you're using whole trees. That would be my guess. But again, it all comes down to life cycle analysis.
All right, Deborah Fent wants to know, is there a concerted effort to educate state and federal legislators about realities and disinformation being fed to them by industry, which makes the policy going in the wrong direction?
Oh, wow, what a great question. I spent a lot of years of my career trying to do that. And it's really unfortunate because we got a senator like Senator Jeff Merkley, claims to be a climate guy, and yet he's terrible on this issue. Wyden is bad too. Even our governor's got problems with it. There's so much misinformation out there that they're swallowing this as a solution. I see it in the chat as well, with all due respect to everybody. They all think that the thinning issue is going to solve the fire problem and that this is a win-win. You solve the fire problem, no, by thinning, and you use the material to generate clean, renewable energy. No. So they're hearing that, and they're producing legislation that it's not just me. Some of the top carbon scientists in the country are right in the state of Oregon that work at Oregon State University. They're emeritus now, but they're saying the same thing. It doesn't pencil out, yet the science is being overtaken by misinformation and this tendency to find quick fix solutions, because these legislators are under a lot of pressure because people's houses are burning down. So they're looking for a quick fix, but unfortunately, this ain't it. Unless you solve for the root cause, climate change is driving these big fires. You're pushing that big boulder up the hill.
And I'll also just add in, and Carol, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to jump in front of you, but the other thing that I'll mention is NRDC is doing a boatload of education of Congress in DC, and we definitely need more help with it. And just to say, like, it is the International Day of Action Against Biomass, right? There's a whole coalition of anti-biomass groups that are in Washington, D.C. and have been there yesterday, today, they're going to be there tomorrow, that are there to educate their representatives and their senators about the impacts that wood pellet biomass energy is having on them. But the thing is that there's so much education that can be done on the community impact side of things, on the environmental impact side of things, on the climate. We could be talking about how the subsidies could be used for good, how they're getting in the way of actually subsidizing energy sources that have a proven carbon benefit to us as a society. So there are a lot of different angles to get at it. And one of the things that I'll provide Carol with when she sends out my slide is just the action that NRDC is running at a congressional level to try to limit the amount of federal subsidies that are going to biomass, because we need to be reinforcing that message. And I think that so much of it does come from the grassroots, because the biomass industry, quite frankly, does not have that much of the grassroots on their side. They don't employ that many people, so they can't get a huge following behind their message. They really rely on lobbyists, and then even like the forestry industry working for them too.
Yeah, and I just want to say that at the state level, Sierra Club does have a legislative program, and one thing that we hear from legislators is they need information. They're faced with making decisions on legislation that can be very complicated, and they don't have a lot of time to read studies. So that is one of the things that we can provide. If that's something that interests you, reach out to me through our website, and we can get you plugged in with helping our legislative program, because there are opportunities at the state level to make a difference, I think. And one of the things in Oregon is, this is the International Day of Action on Big Biomass. And that, fortunately, is not something that we have on the ground here at this point. There is small biomass, and I have a question. These thinning projects are going forward. Probably we'll see a lot more of them. These piles are happening. So what's the least bad? What has the lowest cost ecologically for utilizing that material? And I know that there's discussion about, as you were saying, lop and scatter, mastication, chipping, leaving the material there. What is the trade-off with fire hazard in doing that? How does biochar fit into the picture? And then what they're calling innovative wood products. And Dom, you talked about that a little bit with CLT from a carbon standpoint. So, out of those options, what do you suggest we push for, if anything?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, do no harm. That's the first rule of every restoration approach. And if the harm's already done, then minimize the harm, right? So we know that forests are the best terrestrial carbon capture on the planet. There's no substitution for a primary forest, an intact forest, an old growth forest, a mature forest. Hands down, the best natural climate solution on the planet, which is why I wanted to send that picture for that prize to the best carbon capture technology on the planet. It's right in your backyard. It's the old trees. They're a big stick of carbon that have been drawing down carbon for decades to centuries and holding on to it. So we need to work with those nature-based solutions and then work backwards from that and say, okay, we're going to protect these areas that are really important for carbon, water, biodiversity, recreation, spirituality, whatever. It's a big basket of ecosystem goods. And then we're going to look for ways to reduce our carbon footprint by doing proper life cycle analysis and not shining it on with all of this misinformation. Let's just be honest, have an honest conversation about it. We have a lot of people on this planet consuming a heck of a lot of resources, and we're tipping the balance to the point we are headed over the cliff. And some of us think we already have head over that cliff. It's just a matter of how fast we're going to start that deceleration. But I tend to believe that there's still opportunity to do it right. And so we've got to really look at an industrial ecology and working with nature for the benefits that she provides, and not just trying to squeeze every carbon molecule that we can out of our forest, because none of these approaches is going to work in the long run. The only thing that will work is protecting what we've got and then reducing our carbon footprint across all sectors, especially forestry.
Yeah, one thing that I'll say is that states in the West should be putting resources towards developing non-combustion alternatives, right? Not spending millions of dollars on projects that just create climate polluting carbon dioxide. I think the problem that we're running into lately is a bit of the tail wagging the dog, so to speak. States are creating these numbers that they're trying to reach. So for instance, in California, they have a goal of thinning forests to the tune of 1 million acres every single year. 500,000 is being put forward by the U.S. Forest Service. 500,000 is being put forward by CAL FIRE. I wouldn't be surprised if there's something similar in Oregon, and or if we're going to be moving towards that direction. So then once that is set up, and once that is the goal, then what do you do with all the material that you're clearing, right? If you're moving towards that goal, then all you're trying to do is hit a number for hitting the number's sake. I think that's in large part why we're seeing so much industrial scale export-oriented wood pellet production popping up as a possibility in California. But we need to be moving towards this cascading hierarchical use of trees, of wood, and really be considering the full ecological impact of it, and that includes climate. So often, unfortunately, our state agencies and the U.S. Forest Service are primarily just thinking about the economics, and that's not serving us in today's day and age. We really need to be pushing them towards a 21st century sort of sustainable forest management that is drastically different from what we have seen to this day.
Well, we have so many unanswered questions that we couldn't get to. We're really here at the end of our time. And we could spend, several hours on this. It's a really big topic. And so I just want to say we will try to answer some of these questions in our follow-up materials. And we're so grateful to you, Dominick DellaSala and Rita Vaughan for being with us tonight to really give us a picture of what's happening with forest biomass in the Pacific Northwest and around the globe. I hope folks will take what they've learned and have conversations with others and encourage people to pay attention so we can go in the right direction.
And I have 2 op-eds that are out or coming out on this very issue that I'll send to the group, and in addition to several of the publications that I mentioned, if you all are interested. So stay tuned. We're not done with this conversation.
And once again, you can contact the Oregon Chapter Sierra Club at sierraclub.oregon. Sorry, reverse that, oregon.sierraclub.org. So have a great night, everybody. And thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks everybody for joining.